Welcome back, dear friends, to Fading Causes with me, Mukesh Kapila. In this episode, we are deep diving into the vexing issues of democracy. It's a much used and abused word, a random Googling of which reveals thousands of pages of commentary, which means that we don't really have a settled view of it. To tease out such matters is an award winning journalist and a political analyst who founded Democracia Abierta, the Latin American section of Open Democracy, a global platform for debating exactly what the label says. Francesc Badia, welcome.
Thank you, Mukesh, for having me in your wonderful podcast.
Francesc, you were born in Mexico and live in Barcelona in Spain. What kind of adventures and misadventures have you enjoyed to make you who you are, and especially the views that you have?
Well, when you come to a certain age, and if you look back into the times you were born, so lots of things have happened. So yes, I was born in Mexico, and my family decided to move back to Spain, where they were originals from, at the end of the 1960s, when Franco seemed to be more tolerant to dissent and the regime was falling. So I came to Barcelona. I went to school, to university. I studied humanities. I was writing poetry. At that time, in the late 70s, video technology was becoming available. I was interested in film producing and filmmaking. I thought you need money for that. And with humanities, you will not make money. So I joined a firm of foreign trade working in East Europe, China, and Russia when the economy was opening. And that was interesting. But I was not so much interested in money making or profit. And I went back to academia to study at the University of Berkeley in California on network society. I thought it was interesting to go with value-oriented organizations to work more responsibly and with more interesting people. I joined also the diplomatic schools, did some work as a civil servant, and I ended up in think tanks, and journalism was a place to experiment. So I joined Open Democracy and founded this section in Latin America called Democracia Abierta. At that time, in Latin America, there was very interesting work on environmental issues and with indigenous people. So I came back to filmmaking and documentary. We worked in the Amazon. I'm now working in Africa, doing some documentary on development issues, human rights issues.
Well, your career, it's been a long journey here and there, and somehow through all that, and I see this from your many books and writings, you've constantly reverted to the theme of democracy. Now, Abraham Lincoln, that most iconic of American presidents, defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's a good soundbite, but was it somewhat naive and simple-minded?
Well, you have to take into account the times where Lincoln said that in the mid of the 18th century in America, where all the things were open to the future. So yes, idealistic, but that was also the sign of the times in a country on the construction. But yeah, the question of the people is key for defining democracy, and you have to answer who the people are in order to know which kind of democracy you have. And in this case, what we have is not that much the government of the people, for the people, from the people, but the government of our people, by our people, to our people. So that's our people, excluding the others that are not our people. And this our people is very narrow. It's not comprehending everybody, but only your constituency or lately your friends or your entourage, and not the general people or the general public or the citizens.
So that's how you think democracy has changed in the 150 years between the Abraham Lincoln era and the Trump era. Everyone knows that Lincoln abolished slavery. Very few remember that he was actually the first Republican president, and therefore the predecessor of the current Republican president, Donald Trump. In essence, what's the main change to the concept of democracy that's taken place in the last 150 years?
It will be difficult to see exactly the change because societies have become much more complex, diverse, and interconnected. So democracy has also to adapt to a much different and wider landscape and society. But well, no, Lincoln and Trump shared only one thing, maybe that they were very high. They were 6 feet and or more. But the rest is very different because Lincoln was in the, the Industrial Revolution, was a self-made man from a humble background, and he studied by himself. He became a lawyer, fought the Civil War. But Trump is not completely different. He's made money out of his father's money. He's a tycoon, a builder, a narcissistic, become a celebrity, and then joined the policy for his own sake. And he always money oriented and not oriented like Lincoln on values and the construction of democracy. On the contrary, he is interested in himself, his constituency, making money and making a hero of himself. So the difference between that democracy and how that democracy was aspirational. They had ideals, values. In America now you hear about the founding fathers, the values that they were not the pursuit of happiness and so on. Now it's a completely different story. So politics and democracy has become something very selfish, focused on the exercise of power, how to keep power for the next elections, and that's the main focus. Not the people, but the power.
Still, democracy is a bit like an elephant. We struggle to define it, though we know an elephant when we see it, maybe because of its trunk, its tusks, its ears, or whatever. In popular terms, today, despite the contradictions that you have pointed out, democracy is also recognized by three core features. First, that people are free to hold different political views and to select and deselect their leaders in free and fair elections. Second, the rulers agree to safeguard the individual human rights and freedoms of their citizens. Third, both rulers and the ruled are held accountable by the same open, transparent rule of law. Now, if you generally agree that this is a useful three-legged framework, do you think that the three legs are of equal importance, or is one leg more important than the others?
This is difficult questions because they are so interlinked that you don't understand one without the other. But I would say, if I had to choose, that the rule of law is the key, because without the rule of law, you cannot secure free and fair elections. You cannot secure the human rights of the people. So if the rule of law is out, the rest does not function. But I would add to that the separation of powers, which is key for a functioning democracy. You have the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive, and a system of checks and balances that watch the whole system, that this independence between powers and complementary powers functions. If that is broken, then democracy does not function. And that's what we seeing many times now. So we see how the executive is co-opting or using the judiciary, and how the legislative is also in the hands of the executive.
Our democracy stool is somewhat wobbly, isn't it? According to the Economist's Democracy Index, there are only 25 countries out of 195 in the world. In other words, since 7% of the world's population enjoys full democracy. The same index says that Norway is a perfect democracy, scoring a perfect 10 out of 10, and Afghanistan, Myanmar, and North Korea are the worst, scoring 0 on the same scale. No great surprise there. But my question for you is, are such comparisons between countries on the quality of their democracy valid or useful, or how should we caveat such a glib summarization?
Well, I think the Economist Intelligence Unit is doing a wonderful job in monitoring democracies. Also, Freedom House has an interesting index on democracy. And what we see in the historical series is democracy recession. So it is true that the number of democracies and the quality of democracy is declining. Yet, seeing the world through an index of democracy may be misleading, because at the end of the day, democracy is a Western kind of framework of governance. And other countries, other cultures don't necessarily have this kind of of index of baremos. So sometimes it's misleading not to see it through other kind of indexes, like the Gini index that measures the inequality and will give you a better picture of the quality of life of people, not only democracy, but also other kind of things like services and like access to food, clean water, sanity, and all this. So I think it is good to have an index for democracy, but it's not the only perspective.
So let's get more specific. You worked extensively in Latin America. Why does the continent have such a turbulent democracy story? I mean, look at it now. Its reputation is thrashed. Thousands of people are running away from their countries in a migration crisis, which has become very securitized. There are drug producers and peddlers spreading criminality and insecurity. Authoritarianism is rising, and American warships are menacing the coastlines. What's the reality of Latin America, and where does democracy fit in there nowadays? Is there too little or too much democracy on the continent?
Well, I think it's always too little democracy, but there is still democracy in the continent. When we decided at Open Democracy to open a section to become more global, have more, so we needed to see where a section on promoting democracy and open society could work. The Arab world, we had the bad experience of the Arab Spring. If you go in China, we were banned. In Russia, we were banned. In Southeast Asia, they're so complex and many languages and different cultures. In Africa, there is much more work to do before getting the conditions. So Latin America was the dictatorship. And then in Latin America, the democracy is established. It has had a lot of problems because structural issues. It is a place where basically the economy is based on extractivism. It's a very rich of part of the world with natural resources. So the whole economy is focused on extraction and export. That is done by an elite that has inherited the structures of the colony, and they did not want to evolve on that. But democracy is useful for them as long as it provides some security and some guarantees that the system will go on. Experiments or some revolutions made this elite very reluctant to a real democracy. So that's the system that we have there. Still, there are elections. These elites sometimes have to compromise rights of the people. The people can protest. There are some services, even though. But what is cracking the whole system, as this elite does not like to pay taxes. They are not into the fiscal pact. So they don't provide common goods for the people. For instance, security is an issue. But why is that an issue? Because it's privatized. They don't put the real money. They use it as a repressive, not as a democratic way of securing people or the fair life. So, and then on the other hand, one of the main problems in Latin America for democracy is impunity. So the justice system is not mature enough, and then you have impunity for the rich. So the rich can do whatever they want, and they can basically get through things without being held accountable. And this is another problem for democracy in Latin America. Even so, we have some exceptions. Look at Brazil now. No, so we had this president who organized a coup d'etat and prosecuted and in jail. Whereas in America, we had the same with Trump, and Trump got impunity from the tribunals or and then now he's ruling in the country instead of being in prison. So that when the Americans say we are going to impose democracy in Venezuela, or whatever, say, well, okay, let's see. Of course, there are exceptions. You have Venezuela, you have Cuba, you have Nicaragua, where there are autocracies or dictatorships, and that's worrisome in that.
So democracy is work in progress in the Americas, Latin America, as well as even in the United States. Now, you recently started working in Africa and documenting what's happening there. For example, in Tanzania, where the president just won her election with 98% of the vote. That would be laughable, except of the tragedy of the hundreds who have died. And indeed, even a dossier has gone to the International Criminal Court alleging crimes against humanity. Neighboring Kenya, prosperous Kenya, has had its share of election violence. And now, only this morning, I was seeing some headline about human rights activists complaining about clampdowns before elections in Uganda. So, competitive elections, whether in Latin America or in Africa, are a key leg of the democracy stool, but they divide or polarize society, and not just in Africa either. But so, how do you tackle that? If elections are the cause of the problems and they're a critical component of what we call a democracy, is there a better way to get popular will expressed rather than this way, which always causes problems?
In Africa, it's completely another thing. A general answer will be the lack of institutions or the institutionalization of the system. So competition only for elections that are with not sound political parties, not with civil society that is working on issues, without a mature ecosystem of different institutions that are strong enough to survive political changes. It's difficult to really build a functioning democracy.
So, if strong institutions are a keystone for functioning democracies, does it explain why in Africa there have been already 14 coups and attempted coups since 2020, not to mention the ongoing genocidal violence in Sudan, in Darfur, and the same earlier in Tigray region of Ethiopia, apart from the vicious civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? Would it not be more honest to acknowledge then that the imported model of post-colonial democratic governance has failed in Africa, as also in Latin America, because Latin America used to have many, many coups in the past. I was a child in those days, I can't remember them all. So are we saying that Latin America and Africa are just too immature to be democratic? They're not grown up enough to become democratic. Is that what you're saying? And if so, what do we do about that?
Well, the difference as well between what is happening in Latin America and in Africa. No? So the coups attempts in Latin America have been some, but still the institutions, the system, so it's working, it's quite homogeneous. I would say democracy in Latin America has hope. In Africa, maybe there is something else to do before getting into some kind of democracy. Even though I was in Nigeria recently doing a documentary, and it's the largest economy in Africa and highly populated, 200 and something million people. You see a society which is thriving. You see many young people working with ideas who are trying, and there is future there. You can see, the energy, the capacity of people to organize. They are very articulate. The education more or less is working. There are some issues, past traumas of the civil war, but still you see a thriving society. You see a lot of potential there. So there is hope in Africa, and I think in the next 30 years you will be surprised how Africans can really govern themselves and do it, because they have an old tradition of self-government with that's something that you have to take into account when you see through the prism of the decolonizing and then all this mess that we in part have created.
Well, there is hope in Africa. But let's come to our own continent of Europe and your own country, Spain, where the fascist Franco overthrew democracy in the 90s and ruled for about 4 decades. And this year's commemorations of the 50th anniversary of Franco's death. And the New York Times asked an interesting question. If the Spanish had really laid to rest the ghost of Franco, what do you think of that?
Well, no, the dictatorship fate died 50 years ago. So it's an old story now. The younger generation, in general, people have short memories, are in a completely another page. So that's this idea that the far right have some nostalgia of an idealized regime or whatever. Of course, in the transition, there were some mistakes done. It was not a complete clean cut from the past, and some of the old structures survived. But still, now Spain is a very diverse, decentralized, very open society, and democracy works. There are many parties, many issues. Legal migration has enriched the country a lot. So all this idea of going back to a ideal past, some of the far right is based on that idea, but this far right is not going back to those ideas of the Franco regime. It's proposing just to disrupt what there is now.
But we are also seeing in other parts of Europe, Germany, Italy, the Nordics, Netherlands, and the fringes of the European Union, the rise of right-wing populism, even as the Russia-Ukraine war is dividing European democracies, at least at some level. Now, the problem is that democracy means popular sovereignty or government of the people. What if the people want stuff like throw their immigrants into the Mediterranean, or to curb protests against climate change, or the other populist ideas that are now gaining a lot of prominence all around Europe? Is that justified? I mean, in the UK, for example, they have made laws against protesting in favor of a Palestine state. So if the people want these ideas, just because the governments are democratically elected with strong populist elements, does it make it right?
I don't think so. Of course, no, there is a democracy fatigue or a democracy decay or people being fed up of the contradictions of a system which is complex and contradictory in itself. And this complexity and these shortfalls and difficulties that there are in a democratic system, in a society where what people need is instant satisfaction. They want instant reward. They want a shoot of adrenaline or of dopamine every 5 seconds and so on. So this contradictory, slow, messy process of democracies are tiring a lot of people who want immediate answers. And even though this far-right populism is not providing these answers, at least they are providing this idea. They bring change. Which change they bring, we don't know. But it's change. So people say, well, I'm fed up with that. Let's change for another thing. So if democracy, if the institutions hold, let them try what means be governed by the far right populism. And then if they like that, okay. But I'm not sure they will like it when they see it in real terms. No? And then if democracy holds, they will come back. The problem is if these guys hold the power and then start to dismantle democracy, as we have seen in Hungary, or we are seeing now in the US, or we've seen in Israel. So if that is happening, then it might not be the way back. So there's a caveat on that, the idea that let's break things and front and try new things, but short history, not short memory, and then you will see what it means, and you will shy away of that.
Let's not forget that Hitler arose out of German democracy of that time. But for the sake of completion, let's go around the world to Asia. Now, India is the world's largest democracy, and it has all the trappings of it, all the institutions and rituals and elections and the rule of law, all the trappings. But this is progressively withering away, people say. Meanwhile, in big China, it's flaunting its own unique style of democracy with Chinese characteristics that is increasingly envied and copied by authoritarians around the world. While other Asian democracies say the Philippines are internally rotting away through corruption, for example. And the paradox is that Asia is now much richer than once it was. You know, there was a time when I was growing up, and the idea was that economic, social, and human development would advance democratic good governance. Just develop, and then you'll get good government in due course. Was it a naive idea? Now you're working in Africa and going to the same debates. Africa is poor in its development. Maybe if it has development, we'll get good governance also. What's the link between development and democratic governance?
You see what's happened with the idea of democracy and the democratization of the world after the the end of the Cold War, no, with the menace of communism and this dictatorship of the workers was the threat of to freedom and to our democracy. And then when the Berlin Wall fell, and no, it was this unipolar moment, and then you have Fukuyama saying the end of history. Now everybody will go into democracy and into capitalism, and things will be settled, and history is over as a struggle. But that was a mirage, and the idea that that development will bring democracy was not fulfilled at all. You see it in China. India is a miracle in itself. There's still a democracy there, but even to China, there's a very ancient and old culture in the back. And that holds the society. And so with that, so if you some caveats on Modi and how it goes into into temptations of autocracy, but still there's this deep ancient culture that holds society together. And this has also is also the case in China. Even though in China things have been very messy, the Mao period and Cultural Revolution would have destroyed a lot of the cultural heritage of the way of governance. So now, no, so they came with capitalism into a system of government that is relatively fair. Of course, freedom is not there. It's a society of control, but it delivers governance, delivers security to people. If you don't, let's say, move out of the rules. In other cases, it's more complex. But yes, the idea that development will bring democracy is a Western idea. Maybe in other cultures, there are other ways of government, and then you will only come to the key conversation, which is human rights.
Before we come to that, and you mentioned culture a couple of times, and I noticed you have a master's degree in sociology, and you've also worked on cultural rights and development. Hence my question. Now, in evolutionary terms, humans are organized and flourished through history, through aggressive empires. Thus, as a sociologist, don't you think that we as a human society naturally crave to be ruled by strong men, even if they were originally selected through democratic means? In other words, liberal democracy, as we know it, is actually a lost model. Maybe authoritative or dictatorial democracy might survive, but liberal democracy is really dead because it's against the sociology of the human condition.
Well, I will strongly contest that. I don't think we are in that framework. There's no reason why an empire cannot be democratic. Look at the Ottoman Empire, for instance. It was not so much dictatorship, so it was pluralism, it was a way of governance. Even the Austro-Hungarian Empire was allowing different peoples thrive, whatever, and then they provided, and there are some positive things about an empire. It's government is not centered in nation states. It's not so localized. So no, there are general, not federal kind of guarantees, and that makes people more able to move around, to thrive, to exchange, and to have a better governance. So of course, this tendency of autocracy is there, then ruled by strong men. But if you go back in the Amazon, you see the communities there, the indigenous community. They have a form of democracy. They have, in every village, in the center, they have this common hut, big hut. They, time and again, all the members of the community, they go there, they debate what is need to happen. Of course, they are the elders that they are there, but there's an open debate, and then they decide a collective action for the community, for the common good. And that's a system of government that has millennia, and it works. Of course, it works in a small scale. Once this goes into a bigger scale, then it's more complex. But then this system, of course, the elders have the upper hand in the end if there is a disagreement. But in general, is quite. Do you want to say democracy? Something consensual, something for the good of the community, not only for the good of the ruler who holds power. So yes, now we are in this geopolitical moment that strong men is divided to rule, and then you have these big names. You have Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump. Erdogan, you have Modi, you name it. But maybe this is a moment of history. But I don't think societies are doomed or oriented into having or desire to have a strong ruler. I think the human beings are too much talkative, too much compromising, too much curious not to live in a under a complete organized and dystopian authoritarianism unless it is submitted by violence and repression. That's
Well,
the danger
let's
of it.
come to that. Your favorite topic, human rights. Now, which is one of the legs of the democracy stool. If you look at human rights everywhere in the world, they're contested, they're violated in the social and economic sphere, and also in the political and civil dimension too. And we see the consequences in terms of conflicts, repressions, insecurities. And increasingly, there's little to choose in the state of human rights between authoritarian states and democracies. But the question I want to ask you is what do you think of criticism that there's too much emphasis on the primacy of individual rights and not enough on duties and obligations to counterbalance the rights, and also the balance between individual rights and collective rights, which inevitably mean curbing individual freedoms? We saw that during the COVID pandemic in a very specific way. But arguably, is it a case of curbing human rights? Because otherwise, our democracies are simply ungovernable. And the contradictions that we've been discussing, it'll just implode inwards because there's just too many of these contradictions between the different types of human rights, which everybody's supposed to enjoy in an indivisible and interconnected and uncontrollable manner.
Well, for that, the short answer is human rights is the priority. It's a red light, the red line. So if you cross that red line, everything falls down. And if you don't hold the line of human rights, then collective rights are also imperiled. So I would say human rights, I agree, may prioritize individual rights, but individuals are forming the collectivity. So if you violate the rights of the individuals, you indirectly or directly violate the rights of the community. So I understand that community rights and more, it's sometimes in contradiction. Also, this idea that people are fundamentalists on their own rights and not willing to compromise on other rights. But still, human rights is a red line. If you cross that line, then everything is possible. And we have seen that with genocides in many places, just recently in Gaza. And also, how does it work? You dehumanize the other. So the other is not human, so it has no rights. So it has no rights. You can violate them. You can commit war crimes. You can devastate. You can exterminate because they are not humans, and so they have no rights. So I think human rights and it's the bottom line is something that you cannot compromise on it. Then everything can be destroyed.
Is that what's happened to minority and indigenous rights? I know in the Amazon, all we see is these people wearing traditional clothes coming to the COP in Belém and dancing to amuse the tourists. What's the genuine state of indigenous and minority rights around the world? Because it seems that the majoritarian approach to rights and majoritarian approach to democracies are crushing smaller populations.
Yeah, you're right.
Sometimes to the point of genocide, as you've already mentioned, as we've seen in relation to the Yazidi in Iraq and Syria, Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghur in China.
You're absolutely right. There are many cases of that, and the majority, but deny the rights of the minorities, and that has been the history of humanity. So a majority are trying to crush minorities, and the minorities surviving by resistance. That in Europe with the Jewish communities. So then they are dehumanized, and they are like in Rwanda, like cockroaches. They are completely dismissed, and then you have the right to erase them from the face of the earth. So that's happened, and it's used by the ruling majorities or the autocrats to justify their own system. Not the creation of an enemy, the other as a threat is something that is very useful for people to be aggressive and argue that we are defending you from this other, because this other is not like you, and you are the right people, and those people, as a minority, whatever, they are wrong, and they don't have the right to exist, and you have to eliminate them. So that's something that is happening, and the international system is not able to tackle or to counter that. And you see these crimes against humanity being committed, and little is doing.
I'm just wondering if democracy cannot protect the rights of the most vulnerable amongst us and cannot stop the genocides, the list of which is increasing since the word genocide was invented, then what is the point of democracy? But before we get into a debate on that, let me ask the same question again. What is the point of democracy in terms of the existentialist human threat of climate change? As we look around us, and we've just had this COP30 in Belém in Brazil, and I know you take a strong interest in environmental issues. We've had democratic and authoritarian countries quarreling about what to do, what not to do, and certainly nobody wants to do enough. And yet, when you look at the performance of individual countries, away from the emotions of Belém, you see that authoritarian states like China have achieved much more than democratic states. And democratic states are actually going backwards in terms of their commitments to reducing greenhouse emissions. So my question is very simple. Considering the urgency of the climate crisis, is democracy a help or a hindrance to accelerating necessary action for survival of humanity and the planet?
I would say the climate crisis is so huge and so catastrophic that it's not a question of democracy or autocracy or any kind of political rule, but it's a matter of survival of these species. So whenever, if we don't tackle this problem beyond the different political systems, we are doomed. So I don't think it has to do with democracy, but with the, let's say, superior value, which is the survival of the species. And this is not yet perceived. Why? Because the system, we live in a carbon economy. It's highly energy consuming. We need energy. Fossil fuels is easy energy. It's a very good business. And then you have, on the one hand, the petrostates that are very powerful, and they are able to buy everybody. And then you have the big companies, and this lobby makes it impossible to advance at the speed to implement the solution. Science says it's clear that we have to decarbonize at high speed. But this means changing our economic model. Changing our economic model is very difficult because it means an epistemological change on your mind. And this is very difficult to go through unless there is a huge catastrophe. But the catastrophe is not yet perceived as happening. So if you go to the Amazon or you go to a glacier, you see the catastrophe there happening. But if you sit in your sofa and you watch on TV climate change, you say, well, it's a matter of the weather is changing. It's not the weather is changing. The whole system is collapsing. So I argue that democracies are complex. They have to deal with interests, and some interests are vested interests. It's a gradual way of changing, but still, like in Europe, no? So the policies that have been implemented, even though there is some debate or some going back from the Green Pact, there's still a program, but China is doing two things. On one thing, decarbonizing, but on the other, they need to produce coal because they need the industry to work. Also, in China is not clean. And then when you see how they work in the COP, how they deal with issues, it's not that clear that they are completely in the side of phasing away fossil fuels forever. But I would say it's not a matter of democracy or autocracy, it's a matter of survivor, is life or death. So that in that aspect, everybody on board in this planet should be in the same page.
Well, I think you've neatly sidestepped my question. I don't know whether democracy will advance sufficiently at the rate of that is needed in order to save the planet. However, it's an open question. Let me come to something else as we finish up, and that's to look into the future, especially through the eyes of the younger generation. This is the so-called Gen Z, who have been writing in countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, Kenya, Serbia, South Korea, Madagascar. And those are just the ones I can remember. And they've been overthrowing democratically elected governments in some of these places. Noteworthy is that many of these countries scored higher than the average for the region in terms of freedoms. And yet these young people obviously don't have enough confidence in democratic institutions and prefer to take their grievances onto the street, often accompanied with violence and destruction. This cannot be ignored. After all, Gen Z makes up 2 billion, or a quarter of the world's population. So does what's happening here spell the end of future peaceful change through democratic means? And what would you advise to regain the trust of this young, disgruntled population?
To be optimistic and to be positive on the future of our civilization and humanity. It's sometimes hard to defend, but optimism is at the end of the day a moral duty. So if you are a pessimist, you will at the end destroy things. If you are optimist, you will have maybe the chance or the hope to construct something that will ameliorate the conditions you live in. So for these new generations, they will realize that they have to be optimists and not pessimists. That's a challenging question. I would say we are in a very difficult moment because young generation brains are hacked by artificial intelligence, by mobile devices and so on. So they are very much into very short attention span, where it can be very difficult to have an argument to in an abstract way, to think ahead, to have an elaborated vision. They need immediate results, need a shot of dopamine to get an answer. And then if you combine that with artificial intelligence, which is hacking your brain, you will become a society of stupid people just consuming or whatever. And then if you take to the streets, taking to the streets has been a means of change. Historically, many revolutions or counter-revolutions. So maybe before they had a purpose. Now, maybe it's destroying because of maybe incapacity of thinking ahead, of figuring out a future. And this comes also with the crisis of the idea of progress. And this is something that haunts this generation and which did not haunt our generation. Our generation believed in progress. We believed that we could go ahead. There were problems, but there were also solutions. That there's a need to engage, to work for it, and then you will see better times. Now, new generations have lost that idea is progress. So maybe the lesson will be go through our times, and then you will come back to the defense of a better society and an idea that we can progress. We can all collectively go ahead with a.
I don't know what the young generation would say listening to you, and whether or not what you're saying is to blame them for their stupidity and their reliance on TikTok and smart technology. However, that's another debate to have. I don't want to open that up now. And I'm not quite sure, as we conclude, whether your message is optimistic or pessimistic. And your belief in progress raises all sorts of other questions on the definition of what progress is and who it benefits. But that, of course, is why we are having this conversation, my dear Francesc. I've tried hard to convince you that your idealism around democracy is misplaced and that perhaps your lifetime battling for the human rights and freedoms that underpin democracy has run into the sand. But you have stood your ground, you have fought back, you have made counterpoints, and you have rightly refused to give up on that dream of our humanity that works in a consensual way for the better, whatever the better is, and however that is achieved. I think you would probably agree with Winston Churchill, who said memorably that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried and failed. And so we have to keep on trying. Dear listeners, the point of this conversation was not to have a right or wrong answer, or indeed to have any answers to questions which, of course, far more difficult that the two of us can resolve. But if you listeners have been forced to think a bit more deeply, then I think our conversation has been successful. Francesc Badia, thank you for being my most argumentative guest on Fading Causes.
It has been a pleasure, Mukesh.